Hello, good morning or good evening, wherever you are. Good morning to people in my part of the world. Good evening to people in Charles' part of the world. I've brought in top-notch historian Charles Coulombe. You know, he's one of the best historians out there. Certainly one of the best dressed. I don't think anyone can.
Too kind.
But he's also an elite when it comes to doing research and writing books about people like Blessed Charles of Austria. Which is who we're going to talk about today. Charles, how are you?
Very well, thanks. I'm in the midst of an Austrian autumn. Last night I saw the children process with their St. Martin's Day lanterns through the night and drank Glühwein, so it was good.
Wow. Okay, so that's good to hear. And yeah, I've only spent one night in Austria in my entire life, just passing through. Stopped at a hotel in Muhlbach, Muhlbach. I don't know if you've heard of that small town.
Mühlbach, yeah.
You've heard of it? Oh, yeah. It's the
I've
only.
even seen it on the map.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, that's the only. Before we get started, since you're an American, do you maybe want to take 30 seconds and give your 50 cents on the American election last week?
Yeah, well, it definitely happened. Despite our best efforts, it occurred. My friends on the left are range from suicidal to horrified. For a lot of my friends on the right, it seems to be the kingdom coming and the year of jubilo. For me, I say I'm thrilled Kamala lost and disappointed Donald won. No, only because number one, I have in any case a suspicion of the political class anyway. But President Trump, he's flip flopped now on abortion.
Yeah, he
I
has.
can't say that I'm surprised. And you may say, oh well, he had to do that to be elected president. Well, what if you had to prostitute your daughter to get elected president?
Yeah.
I mean, but to be fair to him, I don't think he's got what you would call an ideological center. I think he's got a very sentimental love of the United States. I mean, which is kind of refreshing to have in a world leader. As opposed to any of the European leaders, your own Justin Trudeau, who seem to hate the countries they've inherited.
Yeah,
Uh,
I believe that. Yeah.
they want to remake them in their own precious image,
In the image
uh,
of the World Economic Forum, yeah.
or whatever it is. I mean, I they can't stand what they've got, and they really hate their peoples. That's if nothing else came out of COVID, it's that. You know, their glee in suppressing and smacking them around. Uh, but anyway, I digress. The point is that with the Donald, he went in favor of gay marriage and said as much. It's the law of the land, so he doesn't have a problem with it. That being said, I mean, I'm sure happy Kamala wasn't elected. And after all, if Kamala had been elected, I think it's likely we would have had war in Ukraine, and less likely we'd have war in the Near East. Now that Donald's elected, I suppose it's the reverse.
Mm.
If we can spend the next 4 years not getting into a war, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, I don't think either of the wars going on in the world meet the criterion of just war, which Saint Augustine gave us and the church has enshrined into dogma. So yeah. So we are here to talk about Charles of Austria and your book. A book called Blessed Charles of Austria, a Holy Emperor and His Legacy, published by, I think, 10. Yeah, 10. a little story here on. You remember a couple months ago, Tucker Carlson had that historian on
Oh,
Daryl Cooper,
yes.
and it was controversial. It got over 1 million views. It's since been shadow banned. It's still on, but you have to like search hard for it now. And he runs the Martyr Made podcast. And I heard some people, including him, a tweet on X, some people talking about that. And I said to Martyr Made, Daryl Cooper, the controversial historian who was on Tucker Carlson, I'm like, Charles Coulombe has a book about him, and he writes, I just bought it, you know. So I got Daryl Cooper, the controversial historian of the day, to purchase your book.
Well, I hope he reads it. I hope he enjoys it. You know, and of course, part of the problem we have in Nectario says happy belated birthday. Thank you, Nectarios.
Happy belated birthday, also.
Thank you. You know, the problem we have in looking at so much of our history is that, well, as they say, history is written by the winners. Now, if you look at a man like Hitler, who hated Emperor Karl, by the way, he had a deep personal loathing for him, which came actually from seeing him at a hotel when Hitler was, you know, he was a poor, starving artist in Vienna, and he took on all sorts of garbagey jobs. And he was doing one of these at this hotel, and there was a ball, and he saw the then Archduke Karl alight from his carriage and go into the ball. Well, he conceived an intense hatred for him. You know, why is he going then and I'm here? You know, which, if that's your reaction to anybody about anything, there's not a lot to be said to you. You know, gee, I don't know why. Ask God, don't ask me. But
Amen.
Nevertheless, I mention this because so much of the way history is presented, especially the two world wars, is basically done to justify where we are now.
Oh yeah. That's what Cooper was talking about.
But he was correct. I didn't see the interview, to be honest, but one of the things, you know, people were complaining that he said that you know, Britain could have stayed out of war with Germany, and that's true. Now, would that have been a good deal? Would that have been a worthwhile thing? See, there are a lot of different complex things at play here. So, for instance, you could make the argument, and I believe it to be true, frankly, that if the Allies, and now I mean Roosevelt in particular, because he really directed the West after we came into the war, had the Allies not insisted on unconditional surrender, but basically said, get rid of Hitler and we'll talk, they would have gotten rid of Hitler. The army, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't have been left to Stauffenberg to try it, you know, so late in the game. But at any rate, I digress. The other thing is, when you look at the quote-unquote appeasers in Britain, especially people think of Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor, they forget that these are men who actually went through the First World War. Edward VIII saw his chauffeur killed in front of him at the front when he was Prince of Wales. And you'll often hear people say, well, he wanted to work with Hitler. Nonsense. If he'd wanted to work with Hitler, the easiest thing for him and his wife to do, because they were living in Paris at the fall of France, would be to sit tight in their chateau, and the Germans would have taken them. Mm-hmm. Instead, they did this bizarre, hair-raising journey down to the Riviera by car through a collapsing France, and then over to the Spanish border. And then they got through and went to Lisbon and then the Bahamas. If Edward VIII wanted to betray his country, he could have done it. Instead, he goes on this insane and very dangerous trek to avoid the Germans. So these are sort of little common sense things that get left out of the great dialogue. You know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, similarly, when you look at Kaiser Karl, one of the things you have to remember about him, and why they call him the Emperor of Peace. Well, he was the Emperor of Peace because he'd seen the face of war up front, close and personal.
Yeah.
And my father, who was a tail gunner in the Second War against the Japanese, he used to say, "There's no pacifist quite like a soldier," because they know, in a way, civilians can't, or at least in the way people who haven't seen war can't. How horrible it is. I was speaking 3 weeks ago in Washington. I was a guest of the Thomas More Society, and the picture they had of me, I looked very, very thoughtful, much more than I normally do. And I realized it's because you see me looking thoughtful. It's because it was taken as a picture taken of me in Ukraine, and I was looking at a pile of bombed out ruins of apartment buildings. I thought to myself, that's what it takes to get me to look thoughtful. It's pretty sad. But
when we're in Ukraine, I'm curious.
Oh, in 2022, in August and September of 2022.
Oh, were you there for their national holiday then? That's August 24th, I believe.
I suppose I was. I don't remember it. We were driving around seeing various places. I was there with a colleague, Jonathan Van Maren from the European Conservative.
Oh, I've met him in person.
Yeah, well, he's a Canadian.
Yeah, and he's done a lot of pro-life work, and so do I.
Yeah, and he's a really, really, really good fellow, and I can tell you he's got a cool head under difficult conditions.
Very smart man. Very smart.
Extremely smart, and very, very good fellow, to say the least. And we had quite the cavalcade. We didn't go to the front at all. What we did primarily was make our way to the areas around Kiev and north of Kiev that had been hardest hit during the initial invasion. And we interviewed various people and saw different things. And it was a horrible thing. I mean, there's no. And of course, the enormous numbers of young Ukrainians who are dying, and the numbers of young Russians who are dying will have, although it's not to compare numbers-wise with Ukraine, it's still, every man, or these days every man or woman killed in combat is a family hurt and quite possibly embittered. I remember we were standing on the road in this one very bombed out area, and this 13 or 14-year-old kid, maybe 12, he drives past us on his bike like any normal 12-year-old kid would, except that all the houses on both sides of the street were bombed. And I thought to myself, what is this kid going to grow up into? See, that's the kind of thing that only people who've seen the face of war take into account. Leaders don't, as a rule. And what makes Blessed Karl so unusual in that sense is that he had seen the elephant. He was there. He saw men die. The famous story of his jumping into a rushing river during a flash flood to save a crippled soldier who had been washed away, and he saved him successfully, the risk of his own life. He was a man of intense personal bravery. It's hard for us to imagine being led by people like that. We're used to people who don't mind our dying for them. We're not used to people who are willing to die for us. But that's the price you pay for being good Democrats, right?
Yeah, that's true.
With a small d. I mean, the Governor General of Canada when I was a kid was Vanier. Okay. And Vanier was a war hero, the First World War. Really, an impressive individual. And if that weren't strange enough, he and his wife have been proposed for sainthood.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the kind of caliber one saw being made governors general in Canada. I don't know that you'd see the same thing now.
Well, and keep in mind, one of the old governor generals, I think this is a bit back, was Lord Tweedsmuir, who's one of the greatest
Yes.
authors. Like his books, his Richard Hannay
Yeah.
series. I don't know if you've ever read those books. I've read a couple. I haven't read them all, but I read the 39
39
steps,
steps. 39
then
steps.
Green Mantle, and I've got to read the next one. But just brilliant author. Like that's who we used to have. Now we got these.
Well, government houses from Halifax to Victoria have been turned into retirement homes for washed-up politicos, and that's not a good thing because it brings the viceregal office and, in fact, governance itself a step down. But at the same time that you had Vanier, you had in Quebec a man I consider to have been, as it were, the last breath of the old Quebec, and that was Paul Comtois.
Oh, I've heard the name. I couldn't tell you anything about him.
Well, he was the lieutenant governor of Quebec from, I think, 58 to 66. So he represented the Queen in the province. And one night in 66, a fire broke out in Government House, Bois de Coulanges, as it was called, Spencerwood for our Anglo friends. And that fire, the Comtois, after he got all of the servants and the guests and his family out of the place, he went back to the private chapel to rescue the Blessed Sacrament, and he got him, but the roof collapsed on him.
Ooh.
And he shoved the pyx under him. He was a big guy, he was very large, and the fire sheared off his arms, it burned his back, but it did not reach the Blessed Sacrament. So he did, in fact, save the Blessed Sacrament. And that is what the French Canadians were like once upon a time.
Once upon a time, yeah. It's been a while, but...
Well, I like to say the Quiet Revolution turned the Anglo-Canadians into Americans who weren't American, and the French Canadians into Americans who spoke English, who spoke French. Because the Révolution Tranquille, it ripped out for the heart of French Canada what made us worthwhile, and it damaged the Anglo-Canadians too.
Yeah, because we're like right now, we're kind of like Americans that are a bit further north,
Yeah, and with even stupider leadership, and that's hard.
Yeah, it's a race to the bottom, but we're winning.
Yeah, we'll show them. No, I like to say about Justin Trudeau that he's got his father's morals and his mother's brains.
That's that's a good description.
I mean that in a nice way.
Yeah, no, because I've seen clips of his father, like he died in the 90s, right? But I remember, you can go see clips of old debates on YouTube, and he seems legions more intelligent than his son,
Oh yeah,
my parents still didn't like him. I'm in Western Canada, and the Westerners really hated Trudeau Sr. and Trudeau Jr. for that matter. But it seems like he had some class to him, unlike Justin, who is...
Well, he was Pierre was a member of the La Cité group, who were a group of supposed intellectuals of about the 40s to the 60s, who wanted to see Quebec become a modern society, and by extension, all of Canada in Pierre's limited mind. And instead, what they became was a caricature of nothing in particular.
That's a good way of putting it, yeah.
Well, I mean, George Grant, who wrote Lament for a Nation, which I recommend highly if you've not read it, or even if you have. He really caught Anglo-Canada's demise and understood, a lot of a lot of the, and I'm not wandering too far from Emperor Karl, as you'll see. I do have a point to all of this. A lot of my my brethren in Quebec have told me that I've accepted the so-called two-nation myth and things like that. But I would say that my experience as an American French Canadian has been this. In 100 years, the French Canadians in New England were almost entirely assimilated. They weren't in Canada. All right. I mean, as an historian, I like to start with the facts first. Now, what was it that allowed the French Canadians to survive in Canada? The Anglo-Canadians. And what was it that allowed the Anglo-Canadians to survive and not be part of the U.S.? The French Canadians.
Well, you think that? Do you think maybe that they had such a dislike for each other they wanted nothing to do with them? Like that's why in Canada, in our charter, there's a Catholic school system.
Yeah.
A Catholic school system built in, and the whole idea was not to, because the people who didn't like Catholics, they wanted us, away from the precious WASP elite.
Well,
We were
believe
scum.
me, there wasn't. Let's put it this way: a lot of really great things were done not for the best of reasons, but for the Quebec Act, which incidentally is denounced in the Declaration of Independence. Just thought I'd point that out there for those unclear to reality. The fact remains that you had two realities: the French and the English, and of course within the English, you had Catholic versus Protestant. The Protestant Anglos were dominant, without a doubt. But that's the way it was, and the price of continued existence for ourselves was to collaborate with the Anglos and not being American. Remember, Anglo-Canada originates in the Loyalist immigration from the States. And it might have been a shotgun marriage, but a marriage it was, and it served to preserve both peoples, until they began to implode. And they still exist on paper anyway. The reason why all of this is of interest to me is, in terms of Kaiser Karl, is that he had the same problem. He had to juggle nationalities, only instead of 2.5 or 3, he had to juggle 9.
Wow, that's a lot of folk.
It's a lot of folk, and they all disliked one another. And they all had grievances against each other. And it was so awful. And yet, as a whole, as a total, they worked far better than any of them have done alone since. The history of this part of the world since 1918 has veered from vaguely annoying to incredibly horrific. And it is precisely because of the fall of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy and the exile of Blessed Charles. And they're being replaced with nationalist politicians who were short-sighted from the one standpoint as only seeing the good of their own people and not caring about the various people they were intermixed with. But as being politicians, because of course, really, they were more out for themselves than even their own people. That's kind of endemic to the political class. A pity, but there it is. It's the price of democracy.
Well, I mean, do you think they're actually nationalistic, or are they more globalist, like the people in charge of Austria now?
Well, the people in charge of Austria, that's a whole other setup. I don't think. Globalist implies something in a sense positive.
Well, it depends who you talk to. Not me.
Well, no, but I'll give you an example of what I mean. You look at the United Nations, and you look at the good it does and the bad it does. Now, the bad it does is very obvious. forwarding the whole LGBT agenda, pushing gender confusion, pushing just all sorts of annoying stuff, global warming, all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
But it actually does some useful stuff, particularly in areas like I'm thinking of UNESCO now and the protection of World Heritage sites and things like that, which are worthwhile deals. You know, there is a heritage common to the whole of man that really should be looked after by somebody. And there are also, when UN peacekeeping has worked, usually in countries where neither major power cared, it's worked. I mean, I think of Haiti, I think of Cambodia.
What about Kosovo?
Kosovo has worked after a fashion. I mean, they're not murdering each other.
Yeah, that's true. I went to Kosovo in 2014, and oh
no, I mean, listen, the bear. Sorry.
well, it just our connection is you're a bit choppy there.
Yeah. No, as far as Kosovo goes, I'm of the opinion that even a peace that's sort of annoying to everybody is better than people dying in the streets. I that's just my deal. But having been raised in a bad neighborhood in LA, I'd much rather people be able to walk their dogs at midnight than be gunned down in the street. That's just me. And there are a lot of places that the UN has brought that when no one else could. So I mean, you have to look at the entirety of situations. It's like our own federal government of the United States does a lot of horrible, horrible things. It does some good ones. And of course, there isn't anybody alive who doesn't want their government entitlements. We know that. So it's always a mixed bag, and that's why I do get a little impatient with blanket condemnations if there is something decent going on. If that makes sense too.
Yeah, that does make sense.
I don't mind making a blanket condemnation of Pierre too, but of Justin Trudeau, because anyone who uses the Defense of the Realm Acts against his own citizens for speaking their mind is not a person one need say anything nice about.
Yeah. I remember when that happened. Yeah.
Well, people have forgotten, and they need to remember. Yeah, and it wasn't just Canada. I mean, the equivalent insanity happened everywhere. So don't think you're special.
Well, the way he came down on us with the Emergencies Act, that hadn't been used in 50 years since the FOQ crisis in the 70s.
No, and it shows the sign of a weak leader when he misuses things like that. And that again takes us back to Kaiser Karl. It's interesting that one of the first things he did when he became emperor in 1916 was to call Parliament back into session. Now, Parliament had not been in session since 1914. And the reason for that, Franz Josef described to Teddy Roosevelt back in 1905 what he conceived his job as a modern monarch to be. And it was, and I quote, protecting my people from their politicians. Now, he did that a lot. And one of the ways he had to do it was that from time to time, the Austrian parliament would really go crazy. And they'd shut it down. I mean, one group or another would literally make it impossible to do business. So when that would happen, he would close Parliament, dissolve Parliament, and wait for a while, rule by decree, and then call for new elections or call them back to session. And that it had to be done because they had to be, punished They behaved like little children, and so they needed to be treated like little children. Well, it was the case when the Archduke was killed. They had been, I think it was in April or May. The checks, I think, had been disruptive and it made it impossible for Parliament to function. So the Emperor said, fine, we'll shut you down, cool your heels, and after you have your little time out, maybe you can behave like grown-ups again. Unfortunately, the Archduke was murdered, the war broke out, and the Emperor didn't really want to deal with those people on top of everything else. But Karl said, well, we're supposed to be a constitutional monarchy, we're supposed to have a functioning parliament, we'll call them back. And he did, and they actually were somewhat better behaved. So I guess their 2 years of time out have been good for them.
And I think it's good to remind everyone that after the Archduke was assassinated, it was Blessed Charles who became the heir to the throne of the empire.
Right, which is interesting because when he was born, it seemed highly unlikely that that was going to happen. Just to explain a little bit about the family relationships, so it'll make some sense. You've got Franz Joseph as emperor. He marries Elizabeth Sisi, who was sort of the Princess Diana of the 19th century. They have 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son, Rudolph. And at the time that Karl is born, Rudolph, the son of cousin of Franz Joseph, is the heir to the throne. So, he has several other brothers. Franz Joseph does. Maximilian, who was killed in Mexico as emperor. Then Karl Theodor, who has 2 sons. Actually, has 3 sons, but the older 2 are the ones that we need to worry about. The oldest is Franz Ferdinand. Then the second is Otto. Otto, in turn, is Karl's father. So Karl is the great-nephew of Franz Joseph and the nephew of Franz Ferdinand. All right. Well, in 1889, I think it is, Archduke Rudolph dies in a strange incident at a place called Meyerling, which to this day there's a bit of an argument over whether it was murder or suicide. And if Elizabeth was the Diana of the 19th century, Meyerling was the JFK assassination of the 19th century.
Ooh.
Yeah, it really is an outre story. But at any rate, Rudolph dies. So now Karl Theodor is the heir. But he goes to the Holy Land, drinks water from the River Jordan, and dies. And so he's left with 2 sons, and Franz Ferdinand is now the heir to the throne. But Franz Ferdinand would surely marry, so it was very unlikely that Otto or his son would become heirs. Well, Franz Ferdinand falls in love with a noblewoman who's not a royal. And so Franz Joseph doesn't want him marrying her. They get into a big fight over the issue. In the end, it's agreed, all right, you can marry her, but she will never be empress. It'll be a morganatic marriage, and his children will not inherit the throne. They'll become the prince and dukes of Hohenberg.
Sounds prestigious, doesn't it?
Well, it is for us, but it was a step down for them. But what's interesting, it shows you what a great man Franz Ferdinand was. Because a lesser man would have just hated his nephew as usurping his own son's place. But he loved him. He loved Karl. He was his guardian after Karl's father died. He was his mentor, and his marriage to the noble lady, Sophie Kotek, Countess Kotek, who became eventually Duchess of Hohenberg. She and Franz Ferdinand had an extremely happy private life, and they took Karl into it. So from his seeing of his uncle and his aunt, that was the only sight he had in the immediate family of a really happy couple. And when we look at his marriage to Zita, we see them as a prime example of what a married couple should be, and that's all true. But he was inspired by his uncle and his aunt. The other thing about Franz Ferdinand, of course, is that he was the head of Austria-Hungary's peace party. And so when he was murdered, it wasn't just the beginning of the war. It was the end of any serious opposition to war in Austria-Hungary. In so many ways, his death was not just the cause of the war. The loss of Franz Ferdinand, I do believe, and this came out of my research for the book, was a tremendous loss both to Austria-Hungary and to Europe as a whole. At any rate, Karl, in 1914, becomes the heir to the throne when his uncle is killed. And in the first 2 years of the war, his great uncle uses him as a sort of witness to the fighting, and he sends him all over the place. So much so that the troops called him Karl the Sudden, because he would just pop up. And he would take command and lead his troops into battle, fight, and then be reassigned somewhere else.
Odd.
But, sorry?
Well, that's a bit odd. They ship him off somewhere else.
Well, the problem was that Franz Josef didn't know who else to trust in terms of giving him real information about the affairs on the ground. See, there are a few things that have got to be remembered. One is that in a real sense, World War I was the triumph of democracy. And what I mean by that is that the monarchs of Europe, none of them any longer really ruled their countries completely.
Yeah, that's true.
So, for instance, in 1905, Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas II went on a cruise through the Baltic together. Now, they were first cousins. They were very good friends. When they finished, they signed a treaty of alliance between Germany and Russia that not only allied the two countries, but urged them to call in to the alliance their two respective allies. So, in other words, the idea was instead of having a triple alliance and a triple entente opposed to each other, you'd have a sort of sextuple alliance charged with the maintenance of peace in Europe. Now, who knows if that would have happened, if it could have been done. But what did happen, they go back to their respective capitals, and their respective governments denounce the treaty.
Yeah.
Democracy wins.
Oh, boy.
So, and then when the war did break out, you have the very sad Nicky and Willie letters where you read them, and they're each is pleading with the other to call off his dogs, and each tells the other, I can't. Well, with Austria-Hungary, it was somewhat similar. One of the things you've got to bear in mind is that the murder of Franz Ferdinand was, we know now with certainty, was ordered by the chief of the Serbian secret police, a man whose code name was Apis, A-P-I-S. Now, in all likelihood, he did this on his own without consulting either the king or the government of Serbia. But he was responsible for putting the then king of Serbia on his throne. In 1903, Apis had engineered the coup d'etat that overthrew and murdered King Alexander and Queen Draga, and then masterminded the government that brought King Peter Karageorgievich back from exile in Paris.
So this is kind of like, so this organization called APIS is like the kind of like the CIA of.
Not an organization. There was the code name of the man who ran the Serbian secret police. I'll tell you what his full name was. I can never remember it, but here we go. Dragutin Dmitrievich. Dragutin Dmitrievich.
Yeah, that's a Serbian name.
Yeah, and he would eventually be executed by the Serbs themselves in 1917 because he was plotting to murder the Crown Prince of Serbia. So they'd probably have saved themselves a lot of trouble by handing him over to the Austrians. But the problem was that the Serbian government was facing elections in November, and uh, simply could not. Uh, they couldn't appear to look weak in front of the electorate.
Yeah, makes sense.
So the von Berchtold, the Austrian foreign minister, who was also the head of the war party, he was deathly afraid. He drafted the requirements that Austria gave the Serbs, but he was deathly afraid because it was so reasonable that the Serbs would accept them. And then where would he be?
Yeah.
Fortunately for everyone, the Serbs refused one of them. They wouldn't allow Austrian officers into Serbia to help investigate. And so Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia declared war on Austria. Germany declared war on Russia. France declared war on Germany. Germany decided to invade France via Belgium. And so Britain declared war on Germany.
Boy, if there's ever a real life Game of Thrones, I guess that's it, you know. We don't.
It's pretty awful, except, as I say, the major players were all the politicians and generals serving at the people's choice.
That's sad. Oh man, that's such a sad war, you know. And then it kind of lays the ground, the kindling for the next World War.
Oh, well, I mean, Winston Churchill, who was hardly what you would call pro-Austrian or pro-German, declared that it was Woodrow Wilson's insistence on getting rid of the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns, the Wittelsbachs, and all that, that, as he put it, allowed the Hitlerite monster to crawl out of the sewer, and thus paved the way for Stalin to annex half the continent.
Yeah, you should really listen to that Darrow Cooper podcast. Darrow Cooper, Tucker Carlson, yeah. Because he really goes to town on Churchill, and that's what made it.
Well, I mean, Churchill, personally, I think one of Churchill's problems was that he was half American.
Yeah.
And when I say that, I don't think he really understood that we didn't mean well by Britain. We really didn't. And I think he only figured that out too late. It's interesting, too, that Lord Halifax, who was Prime Minister under Chamberlain and initially under Churchill, he understood all too clearly what Roosevelt wanted to do with the British Empire, and he wasn't very happy about it for some reason. But you know how we Americans are. We expect everyone to be a patriot. We expect me to love the United States and do everything I can for it, and we expect you as a Canadian to do so as well. If you don't, obviously you're a traitor.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Lord Halifax because like he's always the bad guy in like the discussions, you know, because I guess both him and Chamberlain, right?
Well, they call them appeasers, but again, the problem you've got is that they were both aware that Britain could either fight another world war or keep her empire. She couldn't do both. Churchill thought that the British Empire could be saved through the United States, not realizing until it was too late that we had no more use for the British than Hitler did. Not in terms of them as a power. And Hitler he was willing to ignore them for the nonce if he could have a free hand in continental Europe. But we know what a free hand in continental Europe for Hitler would have meant. I mean, one of the things that gets left out today is the Catholic, and dare I say, monarchist nature of a huge chunk of the resistance to Hitler in Europe. You hear about the communists, you hear about the few socialists. You aren't told that the communists, for instance, collaborated with Hitler until the day he invaded the Soviet Union. They blew up bridges behind the French army during the Battle of France. We don't get to hear that part. You don't get to hear that a ton of the resistance in Italy and Germany and Austria and France and so on was Catholic and monarchist.
Yeah, like who is that guy that was the head of the Center Party? I can't remember his name.
Heinrich von Brüning.
Yes, and he I think he lived until the 60s.
Yep.
Because I think the Center Party was like the Catholic Party of Germany, or
correct.
Officially or unofficially.
He ended up as he was chancellor. He was able to rule for a while with the help of President Hindenburg. But when Hindenburg's son convinced him to get rid of him, he did. And you had a quick run through of von Schleicher and von Papen, and then Hitler became chancellor, and then they were off to the races. But you see, it's interesting that the way the governments in Europe today handle the memory of resistance is in a sort of embarrassed manner. Because the truth is, in terms of first principles, they had a lot more in common with Hitler than they did with men like Heinrich Meyer or De la Roque or von Stauffenberg.
Well, was von Stauffenberg, was he a pure guy? I've heard some people say some kind of nasty things about him.
Well, it's easy to speak nasty of the dead, especially the dead who are willing to risk their own lives. I have to admit, I do go back to that quite a bit. You know, Monday morning quarterbacking is the best kind, but because you're not involved, so it's fine. But Stauffenberg wrestled with his conscience. He had opposed the Nazis in the beginning, but what can you do when they're winning? What can you do when you're a soldier and every one of Hitler's gambles pays off? Not a lot you can do about that. And the Allies handed him victory after victory. Austria.
Well, in 1944, that when he planted the bomb, that was not the case, though. Like they were losing.
And 44, as I've said earlier in the broadcast, had we told the German army, get rid of him, and you'll get a negotiated peace, they would have gotten rid of him. But we wouldn't. It doesn't matter who you've got. Unconditional surrender. Well, as long as there was any chance of their winning, there was no way in hell they were going to do that. Nobody would. We certainly wouldn't. But then you've got the Russians at the gates. If they don't move quickly, they'll be annihilated. So they did what they could, and they lost. Had they won, had Hitler been killed, had the plotters taken over, had the alternative government they planned taken over in Germany, things might have been different, or not. But if they hadn't been, it would have been because of the Western Allies, specifically Roosevelt, and not because of being defeated by Stalin.
I mean, I kind of think the Stauffenberg plot, I kind of think that the Allies were going for unconditional surrender no matter what. Like, if Stauffenberg and his crew took over, I think that would have only hastened Germany's collapse, and that's maybe a good thing,
And if the Allies, the Western Allies, had done that and had been suddenly in Poland rather than the middle of Germany, it would have been a better thing for Europe.
Well, that's why Churchill fought the war, right? Because of Poland, right? Supposedly.
Well, that too is an old joke. Prague is a beautiful city, and it suffered barely any damage during the war. Warsaw, as you know, was bombed to smithereens and had to be rebuilt. So I've heard it said that the irony is that the West betrayed Czechoslovakia, and Prague sailed through the war intact. They kept their word to Poland, and Warsaw was smashed. And not once but twice, not just the initial bombing, but also the revolt of the Polish Home Army, which the Soviets stood by and allowed to be annihilated.
Wow. Yeah, because there's a Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but also the Warsaw Uprising, right? Not to confuse the two. Yeah.
Two separate things.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the Poles got it bad in World War II, you know.
Well, yeah, I'll say. I mean, you talk about a country in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, Germans to the right of us, Germans to the left of us, Soviets to the right of us.
And things there were very few Polish collaborators with the Germans. Like the official government was in exile. Like there was very few Poles who collaborated.
Yes.
A few individuals, but like compared to the Ukrainians were like ecstatic to support Hitler, you know. And to this Ukraine, they speak of him positively.
There were reasons for this, not least the fact that, well, I'll put it to you this way, and this is the only way I'm going to compare Hitler to Putin, just so you'll know. The only comparison that I'll ever make between the two, just so you'll know. Hitler went on and on about a pan-European crusade against Bolshevism.
He did.
Yeah. If he had meant that, if that had been true, he'd have won the war. Instead, in Poland and Belarus and Ukraine, he puts in his racial policies, and all of a sudden there's resistance, and he loses. Similarly, with Putin 10 years ago, he was going on about being the defender of Christian values and so on and so forth.
Supposedly, yeah.
Yeah, and well, this is the only place I compare him to Hitler. Had he meant what he said then, he'd be the most powerful statesman in Europe today. But the problem with politicians is that it's very difficult to tell when they're lying. I've been told
Putin, I knew he was lying when he said that. Like he didn't get it by me. Maybe the average person, but didn't get it by me. I knew that.
A lot of people, especially when you bear in mind that was his rhetoric versus Obama.
Oh, wow.
And let's not forget that the Cold War, the current Cold War, did not break out in 2013 because of Ukraine or Syria. It was in 2012 when Putin put through the Anti-Gay Proselytization Act. That was what got Obama all upset and flailing his little hands. Just like that.
Or as Rush Limbaugh, the late Rush Limbaugh, God rest his soul, used to call him President Kardashian. And
not bad. But I have to say that in both cases, both men were in a moment in history when they were able to look good. And had their rhetoric been honest, had they been telling the truth, they could have achieved their goals. But they weren't. And that, you know, that too takes us back to Emperor Karl. Because he meant everything he said. He wanted a peace for all, victory for none.
Yeah, that's unpopular for some.
He was willing to surrender parts of his own territory if it would bring about peace now. But of course, when the Central Powers are doing well, the Germans weren't interested in peace, but the Allies were.
I remember that in the book. Yeah, like it seems like no one wanted to give up anything.
No one wanted to give up anything. Better young men should be dying than we give up anything. And of course, it's interesting that the only other two heads of state who really made any independent attempts at peace, and by independent I mean apart from their governments, were King Albert of the Belgians and Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. And what did the two of them have in common with Emperor Karl? Apart from being Catholic, they were on the front lines.
Wow.
It's almost as though being on the front lines gave you a somewhat different point of view than if you're sitting cozy and warm in a capital. Isn't that an odd idea?
Yeah, where you have this map and you have, kind of like a pawn that represents, 100,000 troops. Oh yeah, move it this way,
Yeah.
Um,
But for men like Karl and the other two, when they looked at those pawns on the map, they represented men they'd actually seen die.
men who they, as devout Catholics, believe they were made in God's image and
Yep.
dying for a really stupid war when you think about it. I mean, I do believe there are just wars. I don't believe that was one of them for a second.
No, and I mean, it wasn't just. But what lay behind it, in my humble opinion, all the major countries in Europe had internal problems. The questions of socialism, the labor unions, just all kinds of internal conflicts. And the war party in each country saw war as a way to get out of those problems and pull everybody together under the same flag. Which doesn't sound so bad, except that what they had in mind as war was something more Napoleonic.
I mean, look what happened to the technically not a Christian state, but the Ottoman Empire. Look how they treated their minorities in the First World War.
Well, see, they took it as as a chance at ethnic cleansing.
Yeah,
and it's interesting too that the people behind the atrocities in Turkey, the Young Turks, they had actually removed the Sultan from any effective power.
Yeah, they were like communists almost, right? Like they
Very
weren't.
close.
Yeah, like that they weren't, and I think a lot of them were Jewish as well.
Of Jewish descent, yeah, Talat Pasha was.
Yeah, and like, because according to Islamic law, Christians are allowed to live in an Islamic state as second-class citizens, right? Obviously, but like when it comes to these socialistic, nationalistic groups, they're like, who cares if Muhammad promised you rights? We're not about that.
No, and it's well, I mean, it was a mess, and the short-sightedness, the foolishness, all around. On the large scale, it was responsible for the war. On the short scale, since you've read the book, you know that it was precisely the kind of short-sightedness that plagued everybody around Emperor Karl, his allies, his enemies, the people who worked for and with him, supposedly. They all were very small-minded, very, this will do the trick. Except this never did the trick. This, whatever this was, would make it worse. Unconditional submarine warfare. That'll fix it. No, it'll bring the United States into the war.
Yeah, what's it called? The Lusitania?
The Lusitania.
Yeah.
Well, I know, gas, poison gas. That'll end the war.
The mustard gas. Yeah.
The Allies will bring in their own, and it'll just get worse. I know what we'll do. We'll knock Russia out of the war. We'll send Lenin into Russia.
Oh, yes.
Well, if you do that...
He was in Switzerland, right?
He was in Switzerland, and they'd originally wanted to ship him to Austrian territory, but Karl wouldn't do it. There was another revolutionary, an Italian. They wanted to ship into Italy via Austrian territory, and Karl wouldn't allow that either. Now, unlike Lenin, they could actually get Lenin there through Germany. They couldn't get the Italian fellow there except going through Austria. So Italy
Who was
was
the
spared.
Italian fellow?
I don't remember. I believe it's in the book.
Okay.
I don't remember his name. But because he wouldn't do that, Italy was spared what Russia suffered.
It's not Antonio Gramsci, is it?
No.
Okay.
No, it's someone else.
Okay. Well, yeah, no, because I mean, yeah, they allowed Vladimir Lenin to. I read a book that I read earlier this year was the memoirs of General Wrangel, who was one of the who his memoirs are available in English.
Yes.
So so I don't know if you've read them, but I recommend that to anyone. And he was a Cossack, and he was like the Cossacks were really anti-Bolshevik, like they really caused a lot of trouble for Vladimir Lenin and company.
Oh yeah.
And then he and then he kind of got betrayed by his Western allies, and then he kind of had to evacuate a bunch of Cossacks out of Crimea.
Yeah, his was a very tragic story because if I remember, was it here Denikin? The Soviets end up kidnapping.
Well, I think Kolchak and Denikin were in the Far East, right? Whereas Wrangel
Wrangel was in Crimea. Denikin was in the Don River Valley.
Okay. I guess it was Kolchak who was out east, right?
Yeah, Kolchak was and he was actually the nominal head of the. He was the nominal head of the White Russian resistance. And then he was captured by Czechs and given to the Bolsheviks in return for their safe passage out of the country.
Are those the same Czechs that built the Trans-Siberian Railway? Because I know those were built by Czech workers.
Yeah, the Czechoslovak. I mean, they rebuilt it and maintained it, but yeah, the Czechoslovak Legion was made up of Czechs and Slovaks who've been conquered or captured rather by the Russians. They're part of the Austrian army. They're captured. They join against Austria-Hungary, and then when the revolution broke out, they was high and dry, left on their own. So initially they supported the White Russians until they made the deal with the Reds and turned over Kolchak to them.
Yeah, he had an ugly end to him. Yeah, that was so unfortunate.
Well, I mean, it certainly didn't build the new Czechoslovakia's reputation. I can tell you that.
No. So, yeah, because I kind of noticed, like, let's back away and look at a more general view from 1900 to 1950. Like, I just take a look at that 50 years. How much change happened, not just in Europe, but all the world. Like, you have all the empires are gone now. I guess Spain technically lost their last chunk of colonies in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. But, I mean, like, you have the Brits are gone. The Americans are the new superpower. Pretty much all the monarchies are gone in Europe. You have a Jewish state in Palestine. You have like, you don't have the Ottoman Empire anymore. You have the Socialist Republic of Turkey, and I say socialist because
you have the Soviet Empire, which in 1950 ranged from East Germany to China.
Yeah.
And initiated the Korean War that year.
Yeah, and well, that actually started on my birthday, June 25th, but like way before I was born. But that's how I know about it. Same birthday as George Orwell, by the way. So I got a question. I was I meant to ask E. Michael Jones this question when I had him on, but I forgot. And I've always wanted to ask an author who's published a lot of books. How many books have you written?
How many have I written?
Yeah. Approximately. You don't need to give an exact number. 10, 15, 20?
17 or 18.
Okay. About 18 books. If you had to pick one, what book do you look at as your greatest achievement? Like you can look back and say, I'm most proud of that book out of all of them. I know that's like asking a parent to say what kid they love the most, right? But what would you?
It is. If I had to make that choice, it would be a toss up between the Carl book and my book on the Holy Grail.
Holy Grail. Okay. I know what one to get next then. The Holy Grail. Okay.
It's called A Catholic Quest for the Holy Grail.
That came out in 2023, right?
Oh no, that came out before the Carl book came out in 2021. So 2018, I think, or 2017, something like that.
All right. Well, let's try to get some questions. There's this one guy, Nectarios. He has a question in the queue. Question for Charles. How did Emperor Charles and his predecessors relate to their Orthodox subjects? I think you kind of touched on that a bit with Serbia, right? Because Serbia is Orthodox. I've been to Serbia. It's a very Orthodox place. But yeah, so what say you about that?
Well, it's a good question. And the answer is that in Serbia, Transylvania, and primarily there, they fostered the local Orthodox churches and paid for them to the degree that in 1848, the Serbian Patriarch of Karlovac in Banat led the Serbs against Kossuth's revolutionaries on behalf of the Habsburgs. One thing that often gets pointed out is that a lot of Orthodox monasteries were suppressed by Joseph II. What's left out when people say that is that he also suppressed the Catholic monasteries that were purely contemplative. So he didn't really go after the Orthodox monasteries because they were Orthodox. He went after them because they were contemplative, and he was a disciple of the Enlightenment.
Well, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, from a Protestant or a post-Enlightenment view, like a monastery, if you're purely an Enlightenment thinker, it has to be such an aberration. Like a church. Yeah, if the people want to spend a couple hours in church every Sunday morning, who's that going to hurt? But like the idea of a monastery where people witness true faith in its purest form, Catholic or Orthodox monastery, these are the truest of believers. Like that's got to be like just abhorrent for a post-Enlightenment person or a Protestant who eventually did that.
Partly, but also one has to bear in mind that Joseph II did not simply suppress the monasteries and then keep the money the way, say, Henry VIII did. He plowed them back into the church. So he built parishes and schools and all that for the Orthodox as well as the Catholics with the money he got out of the monasteries.
Mind
you, I don't think he should have done it, but it's a lot better than just pocketing it.
Yeah, better than using it as a massive looting operation, as Dr. Jones likes to say.
Yeah.
But yeah. All right. Looks like we don't have any more questions. Well, you're currently working. What book are you working on now? Are you doing one on the wife of Emperor Charles? I heard.
Empress Zita, done. It'll be coming out around May 30th.
All right, so a bit too late for a Christmas present, but a birthday present for me. My birthday's in June. I'll have to let some of my friends know that.
Subtle hint there, ladies and gentlemen. Also, I'm just beginning work finally on a collection of Archduke Otto's writings, Karl and Zita's son, about the United States. And that should be fun, presuming I get the thing finished. If you want to listen to my own podcast, I have a weekly thing called Off the Menu, which appears every Monday at the Tumblr, Tumblar, Tumblr House channel on YouTube. If you want to read my periodical writing, the European Conservative, Catholicism.org, 1 Peter 5, and Crisis.
Okay. I've got one more question actually.
Sure.
That I forgot to ask. Well, it's not so much a question; it's a statement. Something I really liked about your book. When I first got a hold of your book, a mutual friend of ours gave it to me. I was kind of like, I don't know, because I like to read medieval stuff. I'm a medievalist.
No.
And the first thing you do in the book, literally the first 20 pages, was you tie him into the medieval monarchy, which was so, like, from the Roman Empire, Charlemagne, the monarchs of 1200s, Holy Roman Emperors, to 1806, and like you show where he fits in amongst the great Christian monarchs, which that just got me so excited about this. Like, he is, part of the apparatus of, like, say, King Louis IX, but he's alive today. Well, not today, but 100 years ago,
in living memory, sort of.
Yeah, very recent memory. Yeah, so that really got me.
Well, this is key, as I said earlier. I think to his a great deal of his appeal is the fact that he's a figure of legend come to life. He's like Arthur. He's like Charlemagne. He's like Godfrey of Bouillon. He's like St. Louis. He's like El Cid. He's a latter day hero. And I mean, we're so used to being run by scum. I mean that in a nice way, of course. But we're so used to that the image of a man who was, as we say in French, au chevalier sans peur et sans reproche. And that is just like, oh my heavens. He's the king, the once and future king. He, I gave a talk about him in Washington recently. And I quoted 2 Tolkien poems, frankly, which to me, in a certain sense, epitomize the mood that the memory of Karl evokes. And this is true of Arthur, of Charlemagne, of the whole gang of these wonderful characters who ride across history out of the darkness for a brief shining moment. They wield the sword, the standards fly, and then whether they win or lose, off they go again, and leaving us in our night. But one of them, of course, again, these are both by Tolkien, invoking that kind of spirit, is Gil-galad was an elven king. The last of him the harpers sadly sing. The last whose realm was fair and free between the mountains and the sea. His lance was long, his sword was keen, his shining helm from far was seen, and all the stars of heaven's field were mirrored on his silver shield. But where he dwelleth none can say, for long ago he rode away, and into darkness fell his star, in Mordor where the shadows are. That's the mood of Arthur, the mood of Charlemagne, the mood of Blessed Emperor Karl. But each and every one of these gentlemen also leave hope that something like this can happen again one day. They call Arthur the once and future king. Charlemagne sleeps under the the Schneeberg, awaiting his return, and so it goes with hero after hero, with king after king. in European folklore. And then there are the heirs to the dispossessed who wander, like Bonnie Prince Charlie, trying to regain their rightful position, not so much for their profit, but for those of their putative subjects. And that poem of Tolkien's again epitomizes it perfectly, I think. It goes, all that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not touched by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. From the shadows a light shall spring. The blade remade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. And in with and everything, in with and under everything else Carl represents, he represents hope. It doesn't have to be this way.
Amen. Amen.
Oh. And maybe someday, please God, a descendant of Carl's or someone else like that, of Louis XVI or whomever, or a bunch of them together, better still, they will come. They will come. And if they have subjects worthy of them, as Carl sadly did not, there'll be an end to this long, bloody, dark night of insanity and madness and stupidity. And its replacement. Yeah. I mean, the kingship of Christ, every decent king mirrors that kingship. And we know that sooner or later, one time or other, that kingship will triumph over all. But from time to time in history, we have intimations, we have, as it were, dress rehearsals for that great victory. Please God, some of you listening today, watching today, will see such a thing. I'm afraid I'm too old for it. But please God, some of you will see it.
Amen. Amen. We will definitely see it. All right. So, yeah, that seems to be all. Thank you for coming on again, Charles. This is our second show, and I've loved both of them. Like our first show, if you remember that, I've rewatched that probably 3 or 4 times. Like just I put on an MP3 as I'm walking, or something, because I just learned so much, and I read that book you told me about, the Cousins War by Phillips, and it's so much interesting stuff there, and it's all connected, all the great monarchs of Europe, from Bonnie Prince Charlie, although he technically didn't get crowned.
Well, the funny thing is, during the American Revolution, the Continental Congress offered him the crown of America.
Really?
Yeah, he refused it. But if he'd accepted it, that would have completely changed the entire tenor of the war.
Oh, man.
It would have set everything on its head. And I think of General Hector McLean, who was a Scots general operating in Canada, and he was the commander of the Royal Highland Emigrants. Well, he'd been a Culloden, devout Jacobite, and when people would describe him as a British officer, he would say, "I am not, sir. I'm a mercenary in the service of the Elector of Hanover."
So I got a question. At the time of Culloden, would you say the vast majority of English were pro-Jacobite, or?
No, I would say that there was. I would say there was a large minority of Jacobites. I would say that there was a large number that were in favor of the current status quo. I would say that most English would have jumped on whichever side was winning.
Okay.
And I think that if Bonnie Prince Charlie had managed to push all the way to London, we know the Elector of Hanover was packing when he reached Derby.
Oh.
So if he had if he had gotten his lieutenants to do what he wanted them to do, which was to a quick march to Oxford and thence to London, he would have won in the immediate. Now, I say in the immediate because, of course, the Whig oligarchy would still have been intact. And then the question would have come in, how would he have dealt with them? And who knows? Who's to say? I don't know. I have to admit, it's been kind of a long time fantasy of mine. If Bonnie Prince Charlie had won and brought his father back to be king, how they would have dealt with the New England colonies. You know, you could imagine
Yeah, 'cause that was around the time. Yeah.
Well, you could imagine a commission being sent over to Boston and demanding their obedience and telling them if you refuse it, then the king will make a present of you to King Louis XV.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, bearing in mind that when New England was at war with New France, it was only the constant sending of aid from England that allowed the New England.
Are you talking about like part of the 7 Years' War?
Well, yeah, and before that, King George's War and Queen Anne's War. Every time the colonies had gone to war, the French would smack the British colonial militia around. It took British regulars to maintain them at all. And had they not had that, then you would have had a French army in Boston.
A French army. Whew. That would have been interesting.
Well, instead of the Plains of Abraham, the Dorchester Flats.
It's weird. I bet the vast majority of our viewers don't know about the Plains of Abraham. I do. I'm Canadian. I've heard of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. But guys, if you're watching, I don't have time to get into it. Go look up Battle of the Plains of Abraham, Montcalm versus Wolfe, who both died in that battle. The leaders of both sides died. It was a bloody affair.
They both died, and they have a joint monument, which I think is kind of a fitting thing. We Americans don't know a great deal about Canada as a rule. I don't have a choice because my dad was French Canadian, so I have to know. It's as he always said, we were Canadian longer than we've been American, which is true. But I was at a place called my mind's going right by Fort Niagara, famous battle, and I've gone blank. Lundy's Lane. The Battle of Lundy's Lane, which was a definitive moment for Canada in the War of 1812, because the Americans were repulsed by British regulars and English, Scots, Irish, and French militia and Indians. So at Lundy's Lane, you had everybody together. It was in a sense the beginning of the Canadian nationality. Well, I was there one time years and years ago, and there was a Canadian park ranger there. So I said to him, "Sir, I've got a question." I'm sorry, I meant Queenston Heights. I said, "I have a question for you." And he goes, "What's that?" "Why do they call it the War of 1812?" I did it my most broadly American that I could. He says, "What?" I said, "Well, see, the British were taking our men on the high seas. We asked them to stop, and instead they burned Washington. So we defeated them at New Orleans, and that was the end of the war. I don't see where 1812 comes into it at all." Well, he turned red as a beet, and I could see he was about to explode at me. And I said, Sir, it's okay. It's okay. I had ancestors at Chateauguay. I do know about the War of 1812. I was just teasing you." And he said, "Oh, thank God, I was really going to let you have it." For some reason, Canadians and Europeans think we Americans are very ignorant regarding history and geography. But there's only one reason why they think that.
Why is that? I'm curious. There seems to, well, yeah.
Because we are.
Oh, well, there seems to be, like, in amongst Europe, there seems to be this very anti-American sentiment among Europeans. Like I went there. They're not anti-Canadian. They're anti-American for some. Like I went there, and like I'm talking with some Europeans. They're like, "Oh, you're from the States, right?" You know, they naturally assumed I was American. I'm like, uh, "No, I'm Canadian." They're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And I'm like, "It's no big deal. You know, it's I'd have probably thought the same thing. You know."
Well, listen, it's a twofold thing. One is, don't forget that together with the Soviet Union, we dominated Europe from 1945 till the fall of the Soviet Empire. And they, on the one hand, they hated that. On the other hand, they envied us. So they took out an awful lot of American culture in those years. The other thing, of course, is if you're a European Catholic and you're aware of the part we played in 1918 in throwing Karl off his throne, dividing up Europe, and basically paving the way for World War II, you're not going to like us. You know, I say to people over here, if you want to love my country, it's very easy. Just fly to the United States, rent a car, and take a road trip from anywhere to anywhere. The longer, the better. And you will come away convinced that these are the most wonderful people on earth, and it's a wonderful country, and isn't it all great? If you want to hate my country, study the history of our foreign policy.
Yeah, that's true. You know, go read a Chomsky book.
Well, yeah. I mean, you know, and I wish I could tell you that. I wish I could tell you that he was entirely wrong, but you know, and for that matter, you know, if you look at the influence we've had on Canada, it's not been to the greatest. Lester Pearson would not have been so keen on putting in a new flag if he hadn't tried to been aping the United States and creating a whole new identity for itself. You know, this
Yeah,
is what
'cause
I
that
mean.
happened.
What's that?
Yeah, no, because I really, to be honest, I really like the old flag. The old flag is
What you mean that one?
like our.
This one?
Oh,
That one?
yeah, there,
Is
yeah,
is
that one, that one,
is that
yeah,
what
that
you're
one. I see.
talking? Oh,
Yeah,
that
that
one.
one.
Oh, that one. Okay. Oh, I oh, that's interesting. You mean the old red ensign is what you're talking about?
Yeah,
Oh, okay. You mean like that one there? There.
that one. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. No, it's fine. It's fine. You see, that represents Canadian heritage. The maple leaf doesn't represent really anything. Now you'll see the flag in the center over the double eagle of Austria and the Habsburgs. That is a flag I'm very proud of. It's the Drapeau de Carillon Sacré-Cœur. Carillon was a great battle that the French fought during the wars against the Indians and the British. But during the 19th century, they put the Sacred Heart in the center of it. And this was the French-Canadian national flag. The Sacred Heart and everything else showing our great devotion to the faith when we were Catholic and worthy of our ancestors. As Monseigneur Lionel Groux would say. In 1948, they got rid of the Sacred Heart, turned all the fleurs-de-lis upright, and voila, you have the flag of the province of Quebec, which is still religious. So I'm sure, just like the crucifix he took off the speaker's throne, I'm sure the current premier of Quebec will want to change the flag and make it, oh, I don't know, a dead polar bear or something.
Oh yeah, some stupidity like that. And I don't know if you know this, but the Canadian national anthem in French has like Crusader references to it. You know,
Oh,
carte bras se porte l'épée, on se porte le quoi. Like we carry the cross, we carry the sword. Like it's a
vraiment.
very.
Well, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
I'll tell you. You know, since you bring it up, there's the what I call the forbidden fourth verse of Old Canada in French, which it's worse than that. What you're going to hear is so horrible. I barely know what to do with it. This is the original version. It goes, Amour sacré du trône de l'autel, remplis nos cœurs de ton souffle immortel. Parmi les races étrangères, notre guide est la loi, sachant être un peuple de frères sous le joug de la foi. Répétons comme nos pères le cri vainqueur pour le Christ et le roi. Le cri vainqueur
Whoa.
pour le Christ et le roi.
Well, was that taken out at one point?
Well, it's just ignored, but it's the forbidden. I call it forbidden. You wouldn't get caught dead singing it now.
Oh, especially not in Quebec.
No, oh no. No. Not with Les Weenie in charge.
Yeah.
You know what Les Weenie are?
Trudeau? I don't know.
No, the weenies in French. Les Weenie.
Okay.
But no,
Trudeau.
Trudeau, I mean, he's the chief weenie, little Justine. And he really epitomizes weeniedom, if anybody does.
I'm curious, have you ever been to the province of New Brunswick?
Sadly, no. I've never been to the Maritimes. I want to go very badly. I'd like to see Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI.
New Brunswick, I actually was there for almost all of October. I was working the election there. I got paid to do some contract work out there. It's a good part of Canada. If you could go to Charlottetown in PI, you can. I'm sure you've heard of the Charlottetown Conference, right? The conference where they first had the idea of a country, Canada, and you can go into the room where they discussed it. Of course, everything's been replaced, except I think the spittoon. The spittoon, I think, is still original. Of all the table, the chairs, everything has been redone, but the spittoon in the corner is.
It's original. Well, the Maritimes always fascinated me. My strand of Scots Canadian blood actually comes via PEI, because in 1772, my multiple great grandfather Laughlin McKinnon, a veteran of Culloden, arrived in PEI on the brig Alexander, and he and his wife then decamped to Matane, Quebec. Their daughter married a French Canadian, and well, you get the idea.
Do you mind if I bring a clip up? You've seen the show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right?
Yeah.
Or heard of it anyway. There was a question for $500,000, or pounds, and this I'm wondering if you'd be you think it's okay if I bring this up? It's hold on. What's the name of the? Okay. All right. That's okay. Ah, man, so much. Okay. There's a question. This question,
if you get it right, will win
tailor-made
you £500,000.
$500,000.
Here we go. Which military leader was the oldest at the time of the battle they are paired with? Bonnie Prince Charlie, Culloden; Richard III, Bosworth Field; James II of England, Boyne; or Oliver Cromwell, Naseby?
Well, what say you?
At a guess, and I'm only guessing, James II.
That was my guess as well, and that's actually the right answer.
Hey, what are we gonna do with our money?
Well, the thing is, I thought, because Charles was executed in 49, and the Battle of the Boyne is 16, I think 88 or 89. So that's 40 years, and he'd have to been alive long before. He was probably born before the Civil War started. So he's at least in his 50s. So he's probably older than Cromwell for sure. And
definitely older than Bonnie Prince Charlie, which means it's a toss-up between him and Richard III. That's the way my mind went.
Yeah, well, he, yeah. So, yeah, no, that's what I
and doing some working out there.
Yeah.
What do you think the answer was?
If I had to stick a pin in with no consequence, oddly enough, because I think it's cheeky, I'd say Bonnie Prince Charlie.
But that's
right.
wrong.
Well, if you'd have said that, you'd be leaving here with £32,000. So it's a good job you didn't. The correct answer is actually James II.
Oh, never.
And I don't think you were ever going to go for him.
No, never.
Okay, I'll just talk you through the dates and so on. James II was 56 years old, actually, at Boyne in 1690. Cromwell was 46 at Naseby, which, of course, was a battle in the English Civil War. Richard III was 32 at the end of the War of the Roses. And Bonnie Prince Charlie was 25 at Culloden at the end of the Jacobite rebellion. Well, that doesn't really matter, does it? Because you're living here with £250,000. We've loved having you.
I just thought, I'm like, I got to show Charles. Charles would absolutely love that question.
And I want my £250,000. I mean, you know, I answered it. Where's my $250,000? I don't get it.
You'll have to call up Jeremy Clarkson for that. So, yeah, that was good. All right, have you got any last words for our audience?
Well, yeah. You know, we live in difficult, strange, and peculiar times. But remember that what is true is always true, even if those who should be doing it aren't. You know, in the 1600s, the Emperor Ferdinand II was the leader of the Catholic side in the 30 Years' War. But Pope Urban VIII betrayed him and pushed first the Swedes and then the French to attack, thus hobbling him and ultimately ensuring the survival of Protestantism in northern Germany. But rather than lose the faith or do anything crazy, Ferdinand declared, "I shall be the champion of the faith despite the Pope."
That's not relevant to today at all.
No, it's got no meaning whatsoever. So I mention this not simply for religious matters, but for anything. As with Kaiser Karl, you know, despite the treason that surrounded him, despite the evil that surrounded him, he did his best to avoid doing the two things that the devil wants each of us to do: to hate and to despair. He never did either of them. And that is a very important lesson for us to take away. The devil hates and the devil despairs. Let him do it. Let him drink his own poison, as the St. Benedict medal suggests. And let's be of good cheer because the victory is certain. And let's not hate even our enemies because they're as messed up as we are, sometimes more so.
And we need to win them over. You know, it's not
need
just
to win them over.
They need to be. Sometimes you need to defeat them, but it's better to win them over.
Christ died for their souls as much as he did for ours. And their loss, when they're lost, as with the loss of anyone to hell, is not something he appreciates. So be of good cheer, keep the faith, and, well, le cri vainqueur.
And buy the book.
Oh, yes, buy the book. Buy many copies. You know, the funniest thing you can say to an author, and when people say this, they mean it so well, all you can do is thank them. But what they say is, you know, I loved your book. I lent my copy to all my friends.
It's kind of like,
Well, all you can do is smile and say, "Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it," because they mean it well enough. They really do.
I'm very curious about lending books out because a lot of books I lend out I don't see back.
That's always the problem.
So, like, I
So
don't lend out a book unless I'm prepared. I acknowledge there's a strong possibility I might not see it again.
that's always, sadly, always a possibility. But
And you always forget who you gave it to. Like a
all you
book,
see is the empty spot on the shelf.
empty spot on the shelf. Like a few years ago, there was a book that came out, "The Betrayal of Anne Frank." It kind of tried to figure out who betrayed her and her family.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a half decent book, but like I gave it away. I lent it to someone. I can't remember who I lent it to.
No.
Um. So I mean, it's not like I'm gonna cry over it. It's not like a primary source on the Crusades or something. That would be sad.
No, but it's still a pain. It's still a pain.
Yeah, it is still a pain. It is a pain. All right, I'm gonna kill the stream now, and God bless all of my viewers.